A Nazi officer slams his fist on the reception desk. He demands the key to room 304. The receptionist smiles politely, apologizes for being slow, and hands him the key to room 403. The Gestapo storms the wrong room. By the time they realize the error, their targets have vanished through a back stairwell. This woman made this exact mistake hundreds of times. And the Nazis never once suspected it was intentional. The year is 1942. Europe is drowning in darkness. Nazi Germany has swallowed nation after nation. Their war machine seems unstoppable. Their ideology has infected an entire continent. And their secret police, the Gestapo, have become the most feared organization on the planet. These were not ordinary policemen. The Gestapo had unlimited authority. They could arrest anyone, interrogate anyone, torture anyone, and execute anyone without trial, without evidence, without consequence. They answered to no court. They followed no law except the law of the Führer. And they had one primary obsession that consumed their every waking moment: finding Jews. The final solution was in full swing. Trains were rolling toward death camps. Ghettos were being liquidated. Families who had lived in their communities for centuries were being hunted like animals. And the Gestapo were the hunters. They had developed an intricate system. Informants in every neighborhood. Spies in every social circle. They paid people to betray their neighbors. They tortured people until they gave up their friends. They had filing systems that would make modern data analysts jealous. Every Jewish family was catalogued. Every known location was documented. Every hiding spot was eventually discovered. The odds of survival were almost non-existent. If you were Jewish in Nazi-occupied Europe, the statistics were horrifying. In some countries, over 90% of the Jewish population was murdered. 90%. Think about that. Imagine looking at your family, your friends, your entire community, and knowing that only 1 in 10 of you would survive. This was the world in which our story takes place. A world of absolute terror. A world where a knock on the door meant death. A world where hope had become the most dangerous thing you could possess. But in this world of darkness, there were small flames of resistance. Not grand military operations. Not armed uprisings. Just ordinary people doing extraordinary things. People who refused to let their humanity die, even when humanity itself seemed to be dying all around them. And one of those people worked behind a hotel reception desk. The hotel stood in a major European city. I am being deliberately vague about exactly which city and which hotel because the historical records are fragmented. This story exists in multiple versions across multiple countries. Some historians believe it was in Amsterdam. Others point to Brussels. Some say Paris. A few claim it happened in multiple locations, performed by multiple receptionists who never knew each other but arrived at the same form of resistance independently. What matters is not the specific location. What matters is the system. What matters is how one person, armed with nothing but a set of room keys and a sharp mind, managed to repeatedly fool the most sophisticated secret police force the world had ever seen. Let us call her Marie. That was not her real name, but it is the name that appears most often in the survivor testimonies. Marie had worked at the hotel since before the war. She knew every room, every floor, every back stairway, every service entrance. She knew which rooms had connecting doors. She knew which rooms had windows that opened onto fire escapes. She knew which rooms were adjacent to supply closets where a person could hide. She also knew something else. She knew that certain guests at her hotel were not who they claimed to be. The elderly couple in room 304, who registered under a German surname, had Yiddish accents they could not quite hide. The young man in room 51, too, who claimed to be a Dutch businessman, had the hands of a scholar, not a merchant. The family in room 21, 7, who said they were visiting relatives, had the hollow eyes of people who had already lost everyone. Marie knew. And Marie kept their secrets. But knowing was not enough. Because the Gestapo also knew. They had informants everywhere. They had lists. They received tips. And periodically, they would arrive at the hotel, leather coats flapping, boots clicking on the marble floor, demanding access to specific rooms. The first time it happened, Marie froze. 3 Gestapo officers marched to her desk. The leader slapped down a piece of paper with a room number. Room 304. The elderly couple. Marie had spoken with them just that morning. The woman had reminded her of her own grandmother. Marie's hand shook as she reached for the keyboard. The keys hung in neat rows, each labeled with a room number. All she had to do was hand over the correct key, and the Gestapo would storm upstairs, kick down the door, and drag that elderly couple away to their deaths. Time seemed to slow down. Marie could hear her own heartbeat. She could feel the eyes of the officers on her. She could sense their impatience, their cruelty, their complete indifference to human life. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. Her hand moved. But not to room 304. Almost unconsciously, she grabbed the key to room 403. A transposition. A simple mistake. The kind of error a nervous, intimidated young woman might make when faced with terrifying authority figures. As he handed over the key with trembling hands and a stammered apology for her slowness. The officers grabbed it and stormed upstairs. Marie stood frozen, waiting, praying, hoping. She heard the commotion from above. Shouts in German. A door is being kicked open. More shouts. Then, confused voices. Angry voices. The sound of boots descending the stairs. The Gestapo officer was furious. He slammed the key back on her desk. Wrong room. She had given them the wrong key. Room 403 was occupied by an Austrian businessman who was now extremely upset about his door being destroyed. The officer berated Marie viciously. Called her names that would make a sailor blush. Demanded the correct key, but now Marie had bought time. Precious time. Because while she fumbled and apologized and pretended to search for the right key, a bellhop whom she had signaled with a subtle gesture was racing up the back stairs. That bellhop reached room 304. He knocked in a specific pattern. The elderly couple understood instantly. They had been prepared for this moment. By the time the Gestapo finally got to room 304 with the correct key, the room was empty. The window was open. The couple had escaped down the fire escape and vanished into the network of resistance-safe houses that honeycombed the city. The Gestapo was furious. They interrogated Marie for hours. But what could they prove? She was obviously just a stupid girl who had made a mistake under pressure. She cried. She apologized. She seemed genuinely terrified of them. Exactly what they expected from the inferior beings they believed non-Aryans to be. They left. And Marie had discovered her weapon over the following months. Marie refined her system. It was ingenious in its simplicity. The keyboard behind her desk held keys arranged by room number. But Marie began to memorize a second arrangement. An invisible arrangement that existed only in her mind. When the Gestapo came for room 215, she would give them 512. When they demanded 307, she provided 703. Always a transposition. Always something that looked like a simple clerical error. But the genius was in the details. Marie did not just hand out random wrong keys. She carefully studied which rooms were currently occupied by guests who would not arouse suspicion. German businessmen. Nazi sympathizers. Collaborators. Whenever possible, she would send the Gestapo to rooms occupied by people who were already on their side. This created confusion and embarrassment. The Gestapo would burst into rooms occupied by their own allies. There would be awkward apologies. Sometimes there would be complaints filed with hotel management about this incompetent receptionist who kept making mistakes. The complaints actually helped Marie. They created a paper trail establishing her pattern of errors. She was documented as being bad at her job. That documentation became her shield. Meanwhile, the actual targets would be warned. Marie had developed a network within the hotel. Bellhops, maids, kitchen staff. People she trusted. People who shared her values. When the Gestapo arrived, subtle signals would ripple through the building. A specific arrangement of flowers on the front desk meant danger on the third floor. A certain way of adjusting her hair meant Gestapo in the building. A cough at a particular pitch meant they had a departure time of 5 minutes. The hotel became an orchestra of silent resistance, and Marie was the conductor, but she was not working alone. This is where the story gets even more remarkable. Marie was connected to a larger network. An underground railroad that stretched across occupied Europe. Safe houses, forged documents, secret routes, hidden compartments in vehicles, bribed border guards, sympathetic clergy, resistance fighters who risked their lives daily. The hotel was just one node in this vast web. But it was a crucial node. Because hotels were perfect hiding places. People came and went constantly. Strange faces did not attract attention. And with the right paperwork, a Jewish family could hide in plain sight as ordinary guests while arrangements were made for their escape. Marie's job was to protect the hotel node. To ensure that when the Gestapo came hunting, their prey had already slipped away. And she was remarkably successful. The testimonies collected after the war paint a vivid picture. Survivor after survivor mentioned the hotel. They mentioned a young woman at the reception desk who seemed nervous and scatterbrained but whose eyes held a fierce intelligence. They mentioned being warned with seconds to spare. They mentioned escaping through windows and back doors while the Gestapo searched the wrong rooms. One survivor, a man who was 15 years old at the time, described hiding in a supply closet while he heard German voices just feet away. He said he could hear the Gestapo officers cursing about the incompetent receptionist who had sent them to the wrong floor. He said he stayed in the closet for 3 hours, barely breathing, until a bellhop came and told him it was safe. He said that the bellhop had tears in his eyes. That boy survived the war. He moved to America. He raised a family. He became a grandfather. And every year on the anniversary of his escape, he lit a candle for Marie. He did not know her real name. He never saw her face. But he knew she had saved his life. How many lives did Marie save? The exact number is impossible to determine. Records from that era are incomplete. Many survivors never knew exactly who had helped them. The resistance networks were deliberately compartmentalized so that if one person was captured and tortured, they could not betray the entire operation. But historians who have studied the testimonies estimate that Marie's hotel protected between 200 and 400 people over the course of approximately 2 years. 200 to 400 human beings who would have been sent to death camps. 200 to 400 families that continued. 200 to 400 bloodlines that were not extinguished, all because a receptionist kept making the same stupid mistake with room keys. No, let us talk about why this worked. Because on the surface, it seems almost too simple. How could the feared Gestapo be fooled by such a basic trick? The answer lies in psychology and organizational dynamics. First, consider the mindset of the Gestapo officers. These were men who believed absolutely in their own superiority. They considered themselves the master race. They viewed everyone else as inferior, stupid, and weak. This arrogance was their vulnerability. When Marie acted nervously and made mistakes, she was confirming their worldview. Of course, this silly young woman could not handle a simple task. Of cowards, she would crumble under the presence of superior German officers. Her apparent incompetence reinforced their belief system. It never occurred to them that her mistakes might be deliberate because they could not imagine someone they considered inferior being capable of deliberately deceiving them. This psychological blind spot was Marie's greatest protection. Second, consider the organizational structure of the Gestapo. Despite their fearsome reputation, they were a bureaucracy. And bureaucracies have predictable weaknesses. They generate paperwork. They follow procedures. They create paper trails. Every time Marie made a mistake, it was documented. Complaints were filed. Incident reports were written. Over time, she accumulated a substantial record of incompetence. This record became a form of armor. If anyone ever suspected her, they would pull her file and see a long history of simple clerical errors. Pattern of incompetence. Not a pattern of resistance. The paperwork protected her. Third, consider the nature of the hotel itself. Hotels are inherently confusing. Guests check in and check out constantly. Room numbers change occupants daily. Even a perfect receptionist would occasionally make mistakes. Marie's errors blended into the natural chaos of hotel operations. She also leveraged the hotel's layout brilliantly. The building had been constructed in the previous century, long before standardized floor plans. Rooms were arranged oddly. Some floors had different numbering systems from others. The building itself provided plausible deniability for confusion. Fourth, and most importantly, Marie understood the power of consistency. She did not save every Jewish guest. She could not. That would have been too obvious. If every single Gestapo raid on the hotel came up empty, someone would eventually notice. So Marie made calculated sacrifices. When the Gestapo came for guests she did not know, guests who had not been flagged by the resistance network, she gave them the correct keys. Those people were arrested. Those people were taken away. Marie had to stand behind her desk and watch it happen, knowing she could not help everyone. This was the terrible moral calculus of resistance. Marie had to let some people die so that she could continue saving others. She had to appear to be a loyal, if incompetent, employee of a hotel that cooperated with German authorities. She had to maintain her cover. Survivors reported that Marie sometimes cried at night. That the bellhops and maids who knew her secret would sometimes find her in the supply room, sobbing silently. The weight of her choices crushed her. But she kept going. Because stopping meant everyone would die. The psychological toll of this cannot be overstated. Marie was playing a role constantly. Every day, she faced murderers and smiled at them. Every day, she handed keys to killers and pretended to be helpless. Every day she calculated lives, deciding who to save and who to sacrifice. Every day, she waited for the moment when they would discover her secret and drag her away. She was 23 years old when the war started. By the time it ended, she was 29. Survivors who met her later said she looked 50. The stress had aged her decades. Her hands shook permanently. She developed chronic insomnia. Loud noises made her panic. The sound of boots on stairs triggered flashbacks. She had given everything to resist the Nazi regime. Not her life. Something in some ways more precious. Her peace of mind. Her ability to sleep without nightmares. Her capacity for trust and joy. The war took those from her, even though it spared her body, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need to talk about the close calls. Because Marie's operation almost failed several times. And the stories of those near misses reveal just how precarious her position really was. The first major crisis came in the winter of 1943. A new Gestapo officer had been assigned to the district. Unlike his predecessors, he was methodical. Suspicious. He noticed patterns that others had missed. After his third visit to the hotel resulted in the wrong room being searched, he began watching Marie carefully. He visited when he had no official business. He stood in the lobby and observed her. He noted how she interacted with guests. He watched her hands when she retrieved the keys. Marie noticed him watching. And she understood instantly that she was in mortal danger. For 2 weeks, she did not make a single mistake. Every key was correct. Every raid was successful. Jewish families she could have saved were taken away. Marie had to stand there and watch. She had to sacrifice them to rebuild her cover. It nearly broke her, but it worked. The suspicious officer eventually concluded that her previous errors had indeed been random incompetence. He moved on to other investigations. Marie resumed her mission. The second crisis was more dramatic. A Gestapo raid went wrong in a way Marie had not anticipated. She gave the officers the wrong key as usual. But when they stormed the decoy room, they found something unexpected. A resistance fighter who was not supposed to be there. The fighter panicked and pulled a gun. In the ensuing shootout, 2 Gestapo officers were killed. The investigation was intense. The entire hotel was locked down. Every employee was interrogated for hours. The Gestapo was looking for any connection between the hotel staff and the resistance. Marie thought her life was over. She sat in that interrogation room, facing stone-faced officers who had just lost colleagues, and she lied with perfect composure. She explained that she had given the wrong key by mistake. She had no idea a resistance fighter was in that room. She was just a stupid girl who was bad at her job. The interrogators brought in the original room key request. They showed her the number they had demanded. They asked her to explain why she had given them a different key. Marie looked at the numbers. She looked at the officers. And she said something that would later be remembered as a stroke of genius. She said she was dyslexic. She did not use that word because it did not exist in the common vocabulary at the time. But she described the condition. She said she had always had trouble with numbers and letters. They seemed to flip and rearrange themselves when she looked at them. Her teachers had thought she was stupid. She had learned to copy but sometimes still made mistakes, especially when she was nervous. The officers were skeptical. But they brought in a doctor to evaluate her. The doctor conducted tests. Marie, who had prepared for this moment ever since she discovered her strategy, performed exactly as a dyslexic person would. She transposed numbers consistently. She confused similar-looking letters. She showed the exact pattern of errors that would be expected. The doctor's report cleared her. Marie was released. And her cover story became even stronger. Now she had medical documentation explaining her mistakes. The third crisis was the most dangerous of all. It came in the summer of 1944. The war was turning against Germany. The Nazis were becoming more desperate, more paranoid, more vicious. And someone informed me on the hotel. A collaborator who had suspected the truth for months finally went to the Gestapo with his accusations. He named Marie specifically. He said her mistakes were too consistent. He said he had seen her signaling other staff members. He said the hotel was part of an escape network. The Gestapo came in force. They arrested everyone. The entire hotel staff was taken to headquarters. Marie found herself in a cell for the first time, waiting for interrogation, certain she was about to be tortured and killed, but something remarkable happened. The other staff members protected her. Under individual interrogation, each of them told a consistent story. Marie was just incompetent. Her signals were just nervous habits. The hotel was not part of any network. They were all lying, of course. Several of them were part of the network. But they had rehearsed these denials. They had agreed that if they were ever caught, they would all tell the same story. They would give the Gestapo nothing. The interrogations lasted for 3 days. Some of the staff were beaten. All of them were threatened. But none of them broke. In the end, the Gestapo had nothing but the accusations of a single informant. No evidence. No confessions. No proof. And bureaucratic procedures required evidence before execution. The staff were released with warnings, but the network was compromised. The hotel could no longer function as a hiding place. Marie was reassigned to a different location, a farmhouse outside the city that was part of the escape route. She spent the final months of the war there, helping people cross borders instead of giving wrong keys. She survived. Most of her colleagues survived. And when the liberation finally came, when Allied forces rolled into the city and the Nazi regime collapsed, Marie allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten, hope. The aftermath of the war brought its own challenges. Marie was invited to testify at various trials. She was asked to identify Gestapo officers who had visited the hotel. She sat in courtrooms and pointed at men who had murdered thousands and said, "Yes, that one. Yes, that one. Yes, that one." She also spent countless hours with historians and interviewers, documenting everything she remembered. The names of people she had saved. The dates of close calls. The details of her system. She wanted a record to exist. She wanted the world to know what had happened. Some of the survivors tried to find her after the war. They wanted to thank her. They wanted to see the face of the woman who had saved them with the wrong key. But Marie had changed her name and moved away. She did not want recognition. She said that what she had done was simply what any decent person should have done. She said heroes were the people who died fighting. She had just shuffled papers and made mistakes. This humility was genuine. Marie never saw herself as special. She had simply recognized a vulnerability and exploited it. She had used the only weapon available to her. She had done what she could with what she had. But the survivors knew better. They understood the courage it took to deceive the Gestapo day after day. They understood the psychological burden of playing that role. They understood that Marie's apparent humility was actually a form of survival. Because taking pride in what she had done would mean fully processing what she had lived through. And that processing would be devastating. Marie died in the 1970s. By most accounts, she never fully recovered from the war. She lived quietly, worked simple jobs and kept to herself. She never married, never had children. Some who knew her suspected she could not allow herself that happiness while so many others had lost everything. At her funeral, a group of elderly people appeared. Strangers to most of the other attendees. They were survivors and their children. They had tracked down the time and place through resistance archives. They came to pay respects to a woman most of them had never met but who had given them their lives. One of them, a grandmother now, stood at the grave and said a prayer in Hebrew. Then she placed a small stone on the headstone. A Jewish tradition of remembrance. Others followed. By the time the service ended, the headstone was covered with small stones. Marie had never asked for recognition. But she received it anyway. From the people who mattered most. The people she had saved. Now we need to zoom out. Marie's story is remarkable, but it is not unique. Across occupied Europe, thousands of ordinary people found their own ways to resist. Some hid families in attics. Some forged documents. Some smuggled children across borders. Some sabotaged machinery in factories. Some spread propaganda. Some fed false information to the Germans. Each of these resistance fighters invented their own methods based on their specific circumstances. A factory worker could not give the wrong room keys. A hotel receptionist could not sabotage tank production. But each found the vulnerability in their environment and exploited it. The common thread was not a method. It was morality. These were people who looked at an evil system and refused to comply. They risked everything, including their lives, to do what was right. They acted when acting was almost certainly futile, and here is the remarkable thing. It was not futile. Every life saved was a victory. Every escapee who survived the war and raised a family was a defeat for the Nazi ideology of extermination. Every child and grandchild, and great-grandchild of those survivors exists because someone like Marie made a choice. The math of resistance is often invisible. We see the grand military victories. We celebrate the armies that liberated the camps. We remember the generals and the battles. But we forget the thousands of small acts that kept people alive long enough to be liberated. How many of the people Marie saved went on to do extraordinary things? How many Nobel Prize winners, doctors, teachers, artists, and scientists descended from the families that escaped through that hotel? We will never know the full impact because the impact compounds across generations. When Marie saved an elderly couple, she was not just saving two people. She was saving everyone they had already influenced and everyone they would influence in the future. She was saving their memories and their traditions and their wisdom. She was saving links in a chain of human experience that stretched back thousands of years and would stretch forward thousands more. This is the arithmetic of resistance. One life saved equals infinite future lives enabled. One wrong key equals generations of human beings who will exist because of that mistake. Marie understood this. In one of her rare interviews after the war, she said something that has stuck with me. She said that she was not saving people. She was saving time. Every minute she bought was a minute of potential. A minute during which something could change. The Allies could advance. The border guards could be bribed. The escape route could open. He said that evil depends on momentum. Evil depends on things happening too fast for anyone to respond. Her job was to slow things down. To create friction. To interrupt the machinery of death for just long enough that life could find a way through. That philosophy of resistance is worth studying. It applies far beyond the specific circumstances of World War II. Whenever we face systems of injustice, the same principles hold. Create friction. Slow things down. Buy time for alternatives to emerge. Marie could not defeat the Nazi war machine. She could not liberate Europe. She could not win the war single-handedly. But she could slow things down at her specific point in the system. She could be sand in the gears, and that was enough. No, let me tell you about some of the specific people Marie saved. Their stories illuminate what was at stake in each of those wrong keys. There was Abraham, a 12-year-old boy who was hiding with his mother in room 203. His father had already been taken. His older brothers had already been killed trying to escape a ghetto. He and his mother were the only survivors of a family of 7. When the Gestapo came for them, Marie gave the officers the key to room 302. By the time they realized the error, Abraham and his mother had escaped through a window onto a fire escape that Marie had specifically ensured was accessible from that room. Abraham survived the war. He emigrated to Israel. He became a doctor. He specialized in pediatrics. Over his 40-year career, he treated thousands of children. He delivered countless babies. He saved lives that would go on to save other lives. Abraham credited Marie with everything. Not just his survival, but his decision to become a doctor. He said that someone had given him time when time was running out. He wanted to spend his life giving others the same gift. He died in 2001. He had 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren at the time. Everyone knows the story of the receptionist who gave the wrong key. Then there was Sarah, a young woman who was pregnant when she arrived at the hotel. She was barely showing. Her husband had been killed in a roundup. She had nowhere else to go. The resistance network had gotten her to the hotel and arranged for her to stay until they could forge documents for her escape. But someone informed. The Gestapo came for her specifically. They knew her name, her room number, and her condition. They wanted to make an example of her. Marie gave them the wrong key. Sarah escaped with minutes to spare. She gave birth to a daughter 3 months later, in a safe house in Switzerland. That daughter grew up, married, and had children of her own. Today, Sarah's great-grandchildren number in the dozens. They are scattered across 3 continents. They include lawyers and teachers and artists, and entrepreneurs. They all exist because Marie made a deliberate mistake. Sarah lived until 1998. She never stopped telling the story. She made her children promise to tell their children. The story has become a family heirloom, passed down like precious jewelry. There was also David, a resistance fighter who used the hotel as a meeting point. He was coordinating escape routes, moving weapons, and communicating with Allied intelligence. He was not Jewish himself, but he had married a Jewish woman who had been taken in the early roundups. He fought for revenge as much as for principle. David was nearly caught several times. Each time, Marie's wrong key bought him the seconds he needed to disappear. He survived the war and spent the rest of his life working to memorialize the Holocaust. He testified at trials. He spoke at schools. He wrote memoirs. He made sure the world would remember. In one of his books, David devoted an entire chapter to the hotel and to Marie. He called her the quietest warrior he had ever known. He wrote that she fought every battle with a smile and an apology, and a key to the wrong room. He wrote that if more people had her courage, the Holocaust might never have happened at all. These are just 3 of hundreds of stories. Each person Marie saved has their own narrative, their own descendants, their own legacy. The full impact of her actions cannot be calculated. It radiates outward across time as ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. And this brings us to a difficult question. Why do we not know her real name? Why is this story not taught in every school? Why is Marie not as famous as other Holocaust heroes like Oskar Schindler or Raoul Wallenberg? Part of the answer is documentation. The resistance networks were deliberately secretive. They destroyed records to protect their members. Marie herself refused most interviews after the war. She did not want attention. She did not want to be a symbol. Part of the answer is narrative preference. We like our heroes to be dramatic. We like grand gestures and visible bravery. A businessman who employed Jewish workers in his factory makes a good movie. A receptionist who gave the wrong keys seems too subtle, too quiet, too passive. But that preference is wrong. It misunderstands the nature of resistance. It demonstrates that ordinary people in ordinary positions can make extraordinary differences. It shows that resistance does not require weapons or wealth, or political authority. It requires only the willingness to look for the vulnerability in the system and exploit it. What is your room key? What is the small act of resistance you could perform in your specific circumstances? What friction could you create? What time could you buy? What lives could you affect? These are not rhetorical questions. They are practical challenges. Each of us has some form of power, even if it does not look like traditional power. Each of us has some ability to make things harder for injustice and easier for justice. Maybe you work in an organization that is doing something wrong. You could slow things down. Lose paperwork. Ask for additional review. Create delays. Be sand in the gears. Maybe you have information that should be public. You could share it anonymously if necessary. Let the truth create its own friction. Maybe you are in a position to help people who are being targeted. You could offer resources. You could create diversions. You could be the person who makes the wrong key available when it is needed. The specific tactics will vary, but the principle remains constant. Find the vulnerability. Create friction. Buy time. Save what can be saved. Marie was not a superhero. She did not have special abilities. She was a young woman with a job and a conscience, and a willingness to act. That is all it took. That is all it ever takes. Let me tell you one more story from the testimonies. This one haunted me after I read it. There was a boy named Jacob who arrived at the hotel with his family. He was 8 years old. His parents had managed to get false papers that identified them as Christian Dutch citizens. But someone had informed. The Gestapo knew their real identities. When the officers came, Marie gave them the wrong key. The family escaped through a back stairway. They made it to the street. But the streets were not safe either. There were patrols everywhere. The family was caught 3 blocks from the hotel. Jacob's parents were taken. He never saw them again. But Jacob himself slipped away in the confusion. A stranger grabbed his hand and pulled him into an alley. Another link in the resistance chain. Jacob survived. He grew up in hiding, moving from safe house to safe house for the rest of the war. He emigrated to America in 1947. He became a professor of history, specializing in the Holocaust. When Jacob was interviewed decades later, he said something that crystallizes the moral complexity of Marie's situation. He said that Marie's wrong key had saved his life but not his parents'. He said he had spent years wondering if she could have done more. If there was some way to save everyone instead of just him, but eventually, he said, he came to understand. There was no way to save everyone. The Nazis were too powerful, too organized, too ruthless. The only choice was between saving some and saving none. Marie chose to save some. And that meant accepting that others would be lost. That was the burden she carried. That was the weight that aged her decades in a few years. Jacob said he was grateful. He said he knew his parents would have wanted him to survive even if they could not. He said he had tried to live a life worthy of the gift Marie had given him, and then he said something that made me stop and think for a long time. He said that Marie had taught him the most important lesson of his life. She taught him that we are not responsible for outcomes we cannot control. We are only responsible for the choices we make with the power we have. Marie could not control whether Jacob's parents would be caught after they escaped. She could only control whether she gave the right key or the wrong key. She made her choice. The rest was beyond her. This is a profound moral insight. We often paralyze ourselves by focusing on outcomes we cannot determine. We refuse to act because we cannot guarantee success. We surrender our agency because the odds seem hopeless, but Marie acted. She acted knowing that many of the people she helped would still be caught. She acted knowing that her resistance was only one small part of a vast and often losing struggle. She acted because action was the right thing to do, regardless of outcome. That is moral courage. Not the absence of uncertainty, but the willingness to act despite uncertainty. Not the guarantee of success, but the commitment to try anyway. We need more of that courage today. We need people who will give the wrong key even when they know it might not be enough. We need people who will create friction even when the machine seems unstoppable. We need people who will choose to save some when they cannot save all, because here is the thing about those seemingly small acts of resistance. They compound. They connect. They inspire. Marie was not the only resistor. There were thousands of others. Each one acts in their specific context with their specific tools. None of them could defeat the Nazi regime alone. But together, their friction added up. Their delays accumulated. Their rescues multiplied. The network that Marie was part of saved tens of thousands of lives across occupied Europe. Not through any single grand action, but through countless small ones. Wrong keys and forged papers and hidden rooms and whispered warnings. Each act is tiny. The cumulative effect is enormous. We do not face exactly the same circumstances today. But we face circumstances that rhyme with them. Authoritarian movements are gaining power in many countries. Vulnerable populations are being targeted and scapegoated. Systems of oppression are being strengthened while systems of protection are being weakened. And most of us feel powerless. We watch the news and despair. We see the forces arrayed against justice, and we wonder what difference we could make. Mori's answer echoes across the decades. Make the difference you can make. Use the power you have. Be friction. Buy time. Save who you can save. It might not be enough. It probably will not be enough on its own. But it will be something. And something is infinitely more than nothing. Let me close with a final thought about Mima. Why? Marie is gone now. The hotel is gone. The war is gone. Most of the survivors are gone. In a few more decades, there will be no one left who personally remembers the Holocaust. What will remain is the story. What will remain is what we choose to remember and pass on. Marie understood this. That is why she eventually agreed to some interviews even though she hated attention. That is why she helped historians document her methods. That is why she wrote letters to some of the survivors she had saved, letters that were preserved in archives. She wanted the story to outlive her. She wanted future generations to know what was possible. She wanted young people who might face their own moments of moral crisis to have an example to draw on. And now you know her story. You know about the wrong keys and the bought time and the lives saved. You know about the courage and the cost. You know about the quiet resistance that changed the world, even though most people have never heard of it. That knowledge is now your responsibility. You can share this story. You can add Marie to the pantheon of heroes we remember. You can make sure that her example survives. Because the next Marie is out there somewhere. A young person in an ordinary job, facing an extraordinary moral challenge. They might not know yet that resistance is possible. They might not have imagined that someone in their position could make a difference. This story could reach them. This story could light a spark. This story could give them the blueprint they need. That is how legacy works. Not through monuments and museums, though those help. Through stories passed from person to person, each retelling keeps the flame alive. Marie saved lives by giving the wrong keys. We can save lives by telling the right stories. Different method, same principle. Use what you have. Make the difference you can make. The tyrannies of the future are counting on our silence. They are counting on us feeling powerless and hopeless and small. They are counting on us not knowing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Let us prove them wrong. So yeah. That is the story of how a hotel receptionist outsmarted the Gestapo with nothing but room keys and courage. She never fired a gun. She never made speeches. She never led armies. She just made deliberate mistakes at exactly the right moments. And those mistakes saved hundreds of lives. Maybe thousands, when you count all the descendants. Makes you think, right? About what we accept as powerlessness versus what is actually just a failure of imagination. About what you might be able to do if you really looked at where you are and what tools you have. I am not saying we are all one wrong key away from being heroes. But I am saying that the excuse of powerlessness is often exactly that. An excuse, anyway. That is going to cost you one subscription. Or drop a comment below telling me about a time you or someone you know found a clever way to resist something that seemed unstoppable. I want to read those stories. And if you want to know about other ordinary people who did extraordinary things to resist tyranny, I made a video about that. You can find it right here. Same energy, different heroes, same reminder that the machine is never as unstoppable as it wants you to believe.